Hey guys, tonight, let us do something a little strange. Dim the lights, get cozy, and don't worry, there's no quiz at the end. We're not here to learn for the sake of learning. We're here to drift through history like a slow river. A river that sometimes smells faintly of wine, goat cheese, and, well, questionable ancient hygiene. Because tonight's guiding question is this: what did Alexander the Great eat before battle? Yeah, you know the guy. The world conqueror, the greatest general of all time, the one who somehow managed to march from Macedonia to the edge of India before the age of 33. But here's the thing: when you strip away the shiny armor, the epic speeches, and all the marble statues that make him look like a gym bro frozen in stone, Alexander was still a guy with a stomach. And like all guys with stomachs, he had to put something in it. So tonight, we're not galloping across Asia on horseback. We're going into his tent, peeking at his dinner plate, and quietly asking, what exactly kept this man running? And maybe, more importantly, how did his diet fit into his very weird, very messy, and very human life? Let us ease in by remembering something simple: food in the ancient world was not what you'd call varied. You couldn't just roll up to a Starbucks before charging into battle and say, "One oat milk latte, please." Most soldiers ate what was portable, cheap, and hard to ruin, which usually meant bread. A lot of bread. Like, uncomfortable amounts of bread. If you picture Alexander's men, you should imagine thousands of slightly constipated dudes with sacks of barley flour strapped to their belts. Now Alexander, of course, wasn't he just one of the guys. He was the son of Philip I of Macedon, the kind of father who drank heavily, collected wives like cards, and probably didn't he expect his scrawny son to become a legend. Alexander grew up in a palace, with tutors, including Aristotle himself. Yes, that Aristotle. So his diet as a boy was already different from the soldiers he'd later lead. In fact, we're told that Alexander was pretty restrained when it came to food. Wine, though, that was another story. We'll get there. But when it came to meals, people noticed that he didn't gorge himself. He ate modestly, which was partly an image thing. Kings in the East were known for over-the-top luxury, feasting like there was no tomorrow. Alexander wanted to be different. He wanted to be the tough, soldierly king who didn't need silk cushions or 50 roast peacocks to get through the day. So before battle, it's likely Alexander kept things pretty simple. Bread, cheese, dried meat, maybe some fruit if they happened to be near orchards. Nothing fancy, which is honestly kind of disappointing when you imagine the great in his name. You'd expect him to have a secret recipe, like some weird ancient protein shake with honey and goat's milk. But no, most sources say he ate plain soldier food, just in smaller, calmer amounts. But don't let that fool you into thinking he was some monk-like figure of discipline. Alexander had his quirks. For one thing, he had opinions about drinking. And by opinions, I mean he drank like it was a competitive sport. Macedonians in general were big drinkers. They were famous for taking their wine straight, without the usual watering down that Greeks preferred. Imagine showing up at a frat party with a neat glass of whiskey, while everyone else is sipping diluted spritzers. That was Macedonian style. And Alexander inherited it with enthusiasm. In fact, his drinking habits caused a lot of problems. Not just hangovers, but actual violent outbursts. There's the infamous story of him killing his friend Clytus the Black during a drunken argument. Imagine, you're one of Alexander's closest companions, you've fought by his side for years, and then one night, after too much wine, he runs you through with a spear because you made a sarcastic remark. Not exactly the ideal workplace environment. So, picture this: before battle, Alexander might be eating a simple meal of bread and cheese, but he might also be recovering from a night of heavy drinking, which is a very human, almost pathetic image. One of the greatest generals in history standing in front of his troops, possibly nursing a royal hangover, holding his helmet a little too tightly because the sunlight is just too much. Now, let us talk about his sweet tooth, or rather, his lack of one. Unlike some rulers who went wild over desserts, Alexander doesn't seem to have cared much about sweets. Honey was the main sweetener in his world, and it showed up in cakes and mead. But Alexander's vibe was more salty than sweet. He liked meats, cheeses, and plain grains. You could almost say he ate like a cattle eater who occasionally let carbs sneak in. But let us not romanticize too much. His food was still very much ancient food, which means it was often coarse, gritty, and filled with bits of stone from the grinding process. Dental care was not a thing. So Alexander, like his men, probably had teeth that told the sad story of too much barley bread. Not exactly the sparkling marble smile you see on statues. Now, here's where things get interesting. Alexander wasn't he just eating for himself, he had to manage the diets of tens of thousands of men on the march, which was a nightmare. Supplying an ancient army was basically like running a never-ending road trip where everyone forgot to pack snacks. Grain was the staple, because it was portable and relatively easy to transport. But when the army was moving through Persia, India, and beyond, they had to adapt. Sometimes that meant living off local livestock. Sometimes it meant raiding. And sometimes, frankly, it meant starvation. There are accounts of his men eating whatever they could find: dates, dried fish, even roots. During the disastrous Gedrosian Desert March, many soldiers simply collapsed from hunger and thirst. Meanwhile, Alexander himself tried to share their hardships, eating sparingly and refusing luxury foods that were offered. It was part of his whole "I am not like other kings" brand. You know, the ancient version of a CEO saying he flies economy class just like his employees. Sure, Jan, let us float for a moment to one of the more vivid anecdotes. There is a story that once, during a particularly thirsty march, someone brought Alexander a helmet full of water, a rare treasure in the heat. And instead of drinking it himself, he poured it out on the ground in front of his troops. Symbolic, dramatic, and deeply impractical. His men loved it, of course, because nothing motivates you quite like seeing your boss throw away the one thing you desperately need to survive. Inspiring, but also kind of infuriating. That gesture also tells us something about Alexander's relationship with food and drink. For him, meals weren't just nutrition, they were political theater. He knew people were watching, so every bite and every sip could send a message. When he ate modestly, he was showing off his toughness. When he drank excessively, he was bonding with his men, or at least pretending to. And when he refused luxury foods, he was saying, "See, I am not Persian. I am Macedonian. I am still one of you." But let us drift back to the central question. On the literal mornings before battle, say, before Gaugamela or Issus, what did Alexander probably eat? Most likely, the same as always: bread, maybe dipped in wine. Some cheese, maybe dried meat, maybe figs or dates if they were handy. Enough to fuel him, but not enough to weigh him down. He wasn't feasting on roasted oxen or downing gallons of wine before charging into combat. He kept it practical, because nothing ruins a heroic cavalry charge quite like a stomachache. And yet, despite all this practicality, Alexander's relationship with food and drink was also tied up in his larger-than-life persona. He wasn't just eating dinner. He was performing kingship. He was crafting a legend, which makes even the smallest detail like a hunk of barley bread or a sip of undiluted wine part of the story of the man who thought he could conquer the world. So, what did Alexander the Great eat before battle? In truth, probably not much. A bit of bread, a little cheese, maybe some fruit. Enough to keep him standing. Not enough to make him sluggish, but in the bigger picture, what mattered wasn't the food itself. It was the message, the restraint, the discipline, the act of being the king who didn't overindulge. Except, of course, when he did, which was often, usually with wine. Indeed, that contradiction: modest at the table, reckless with the cup, is maybe the most Alexander thing of all. And on that thought, let us float onward. Because if Alexander's dinner plate was underwhelming, the plates of other royals were sometimes downright bizarre. So let us drift from the Macedonian warlord to some of his equally tragic, equally weird royal cousins in history, who often ate their way into disaster. But we'll save that for the next stretch of our slow journey. When dinner became Dynasty, so we set Alexander aside with his bread, his cheese, and his questionable hangovers. Let us float a little further down the candlelit halls of history, where the diets of kings and queens start to get weirder, because food isn't just food when you royal. It is power, it is identity, It's look how special I am because my kitchen staff can import pineapples from across the ocean while the peasants outside are literally boiling bark for soup, and nowhere do we see this clash between biology and dynasty more clearly than in the sad, sometimes downright tragic eating habits of European royals. Some of them ate like gods, some of them ate like toddlers with unlimited budgets, and some, thanks to the small problem of genetic inbreeding, couldn't eat much of anything without choking on their own jawlines. Let us begin with the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs. The family tree that mostly grew sideways. If Alexander the Great was defined by restraint and discipline at the dinner table, the Habsburgs were defined by, well, the fact that their jaws were slowly collapsing in on themselves from centuries of cousin marriage. By the 16th century, the so-called Habsburg jaw had become legendary. A massive, protruding lower lip and jaw that made chewing and in some cases, even closing the mouth rather difficult. Take Charles I of Spain. Poor Charles. His nickname was El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because people honestly thought he was cursed. Born after generations of inbreeding, he had the jaw so pronounced that eating solid food was almost impossible. His palate was deformed, his tongue too big, and his digestion. Let us just say he wasn't exactly thriving. Charles I reportedly lived on a mushy, liquid diet. Imagine being the ruler of the Spanish Empire, stretching across Europe and the Americas, and you can't even handle a steak. Court doctors noted he had trouble chewing, swallowing, and even speaking clearly. He was also constantly sick, probably malnourished, and definitely infertile. His dinner plate wasn't just sad, it was a metaphor for the end of his dynasty. And of course, the irony here is brutal. All the power in the world, all the gold from the New World, all the castles and palaces, and the poor guy was spooning gruel into his mouth like a sick toddler. But not every royal was doomed to mush. Some went the other way into excess. Let us drift north to France, where kings and queens developed reputations for eating in a way that was basically performance art. Louis XVI, the Sun King, is a good example. He didn't just eat meals, he staged them. Public meals at Versailles were part of his image. He would sit at the table while courtiers crowded in to watch him chew, which sounds absolutely horrifying if you think about it too hard. And Louis wasn't exactly dainty. According to witnesses, he would plow through soup, whole chickens, multiple cuts of mutton, salad, pastries, fruit, and hard-boiled eggs all in one sitting. Which makes you wonder, did anyone ever not clap when he finished? Or did everyone politely pretend this mountain of food was just enough? Of course, digestion wasn't his strong suit. He suffered from chronic constipation, which is not surprising if your daily calorie intake is the size of a small village's harvest. Still, the Sun King made meals into a spectacle. Food wasn't about hunger. It was about being seen. It was a way to remind everyone, I am the sun, you're just orbiting. But not every French royal handled food with such confidence. Take Marie Antoinette. Everyone knows the fake line, let them eat cake. She never actually said that. But what she did have was a fondness for sweets. At Versailles, she built herself a little fantasy village called the Petit Trianon, complete with a make-believe farm. There, she could play at being a shepherdess and nibble on delicate pastries while dressed in simple muslin gowns. It was food as escapism. While the country starved, the queen retreated into a world of whipped cream and sugar, which, of course, didn't play well politically. You can almost see the disconnect, peasants gnawing on stale bread while the queen stages a tea party in her dollhouse farm. Not exactly a recipe for good PR. Now, let us drift over to England, where the Tudors were famously indulgent. Henry V in particular. You know, the one with 6 wives and the ulcerated leg. He wasn't exactly eating kale salads. Henry loved meat, mountains of it. Venison, beef, mutton, pork, swan, even dolphin when he could get it. Vegetables? Absolutely not. Those were for peasants. A Tudor banquet was basically a cholesterol festival, with pies and roasted animals brought out in endless courses. Henry reportedly ate so much that gout became his close personal friend, and by the end of his life, he was so overweight he had to be winched onto his horse. But here's the twist, his kitchens at Hampton Court weren't just for indulgence. They were logistical marvels. Dozens of cooks worked non-stop, feeding hundreds of courtiers every day. Food was politics. If you were invited to eat, you mattered. If you weren't, you were out. So when Henry shoved another drumstick into his face, it wasn't just gluttony. It was strategy. Messy, greasy strategy. And then, of course, there are the truly bizarre royal diets, like Charles I of England, the Restoration King, not the sad Spanish one. Charles was obsessed with chocolate, not the Snickers bar kind, but the hot, spiced drinking chocolate imported from the Americas. He believed it was energizing, maybe even an aphrodisiac, which, considering his legendary number of mistresses, he probably didn't need extra help with. Court gossip claimed he was constantly sipping the stuff, like an early modern energy drink addict. Or consider Peter the Great of Russia, who reportedly loved pickles so much he'd eat entire barrels. Which is a choice. Imagine being 6'7", terrifying, half drunk on vodka, and crunching through cucumbers and brine while lecturing nobles about shaving their beards. Not exactly subtle. And of course, lurking beneath all these royal food stories is the same theme, power wrapped in absurdity. Alexander with his bread and wine, pretending to be one of the boys. Charles I of Spain, barely able to swallow. Louis Ziv, turning every bite into a performance. Henry V, literally eating himself into medical collapse. Marie Antoinette, playing shepherdess with her pastries. Charles I of England, hopped up on liquid chocolate. Food was never just food. It was identity, dynasty, theater, and sometimes, it was tragedy. So as we keep floating tonight, let us keep that in mind. Behind the crowns and the jewels, these were just people with stomachs. Hungry, spoiled, sometimes sickly, sometimes starving. And often, their entire reigns can be read in what they chose or couldn't choose to eat. But for now, let us glide away from Versailles and Hampton Court, away from the royal banquets and the mushy diets. Let us drift gently onward, to the royal children. The sad, spoiled, and sometimes sickly little heirs, whose meals tell us just as much about their doomed futures. Sad, sickly, and spoiled, a guide to royal children at the dinner table. So we've seen Alexander as simple bread and cheese rations. We've shuffled past the banquet halls of Versailles and Hampton Court. Now let us step into the quieter, and honestly more tragic, rooms of history, the nurseries, because royal children had some of the strangest, saddest, and most telling relationships with food. They were supposed to be symbols of health and future glory, but in reality, they were often fragile little bundles of dynastic anxiety, fussed over by armies of nurses, doctors, and courtiers. Spoiled, rotten, underfed, overfed, or just unlucky. And if you want a nice, sleepy reminder of how not fun being royal could be, look no further than the royal high chair. Let us start with France again. Because the Bourbon dynasty was basically a case study in what happens when you feed kids poorly and hope genetics does the rest. Take the Dauphins, the heirs to the French throne. They were treated like living national treasures, which meant every spoonful of food they ate was a matter of state. Meals were public affairs, overseen by attendants who made sure nothing was poisoned. But the irony? Despite all that pomp, the actual food was usually terrible for a growing child. For example, Louis XV's son, the Dauphin Louis Ferdinand, was raised on heavy, overcooked foods and little exercise. He grew up sickly and prone to fevers. His own children, the ill-fated Louis XV and his brothers, followed the same pattern. By the time Louis XV was a teenager, observers noted he was pudgy, sluggish, and preferred hunting to courtly life. Which is fine if you raise an average French noble. Less fine if you raise supposed to be the glowing embodiment of a future king. And do you remember Marie Antoinette's son, the little Louis Charles, who became Louis XV in name only? He spent his short life being overprotected, overstuffed with rich foods, and then, tragically, starved in prison after the revolution. His diet went from sugar-dusted treats in Versailles to scraps of moldy bread in a dank cell. The contrast could not be more brutal, but the French weren't alone. The Habsburgs, those professional inbreeders, also churned out some very sad, very fragile heirs. Take the children of Empress Maria Theresa in the 18th century. She had 16 of them, yes, 16, though not all survived to adulthood. They were raised in the glittering courts of Vienna, surrounded by music, tutors, and elaborate meals. But the Habsburg genetic cocktail meant many of them were weak or chronically ill. Joseph I, for example, had a famously delicate constitution. He suffered from fevers, digestive issues, and ulcers. Court doctors prescribed all sorts of bizarre diets, from bland broths to strict fasting. Imagine being the heir to an empire, but your daily reality is being told by some powdered wig doctor that you can have cheese because your humors are unbalanced. And then there were the infant Habsburgs who never even made it past the mush stage. High infant mortality was common, but among dynasties obsessed with bloodlines, every lost baby was a political crisis, which meant endless rituals around feeding, nursing versus wet nurses, porridge recipes, early weaning debates. The stakes were absurdly high for what, in the end, was still just spooning mush into a cranky toddler. Let us float across to England again. The Tudors and Stuarts had their own string of heartbreaks when it came to royal children. Think about Henry VI's desperate obsession with a male heir. His daughters Mary and Elizabeth survived, but his only legitimate son, Edward VI, grew up frail. He was a small, pale boy with chronic health problems. His diet, like many Tudor royals, was stuffed with meat and sugar but lacking in vegetables. Not exactly a recipe for a long life. He became king at 9, dead at 15. All that power, and probably never once told to eat his greens. Fast forward to the Stuarts, and you get poor little Charles, Duke of Cambridge, son of James I. This toddler was reported to be constantly ill, plagued with digestive problems, and basically smothered with medical interventions, which usually meant purges, enemas, or special diets of watery gruel. If you were a royal child in the 17th century, your odds of surviving both your genes and your doctors were not great. Indeed, while we ray on doomed dynasties, we can skip Russia. The Romanovs produced their fair share of tragic royal children, and much of it revolved around food or the inability to process it. Most famously, Alexei Romanov, the only son of Nicholas I and heir to the throne, had hemophilia, which meant even the smallest bump could cause internal bleeding. He wasn't particularly sick from food, but his condition meant he was treated like glass. Meals were tightly controlled, and the boy lived under constant surveillance. His weakness was hidden from the public, but at home, every sip of soup was laced with parental panic. It wasn't help that Rasputin, the family's infamous holy man, gave dietary advice. He told the boy to avoid certain foods, recommended long fasts, and sometimes insisted prayers were more useful than medicine. Not exactly modern pediatrics. And in the end, of course, no diet could protect Alexei from the darker fate that awaited the Romanovs. Now, let us drift back to the lighter, if no less sad, side of things. Spoiled royal kids, because for every weak and sickly heir, there were plenty of little princes and princesses who were raised in such luxury that they grew into adults completely detached from reality. Take Louis XIV's son, the Grand Dauphin. As a boy, he was fed like a miniature king, extravagant feasts, candies, and pastries. By adulthood, he was massive, slow-witted, and nicknamed Monseigneur. He wasn't cruel or malicious. He was just soft, a product of overfeeding and overindulgence. The kind of guy who'd rather nap after a heavy meal than think about ruling an empire, or think of Spanish and Austrian archdukes raised on endless sweets, kept indoors and cosseted by nurses. Many of them grew up not just physically weak, but emotionally fragile, which might explain why so many royal courts were filled with tantrum-prone adults who still acted like picky eaters at the dinner table. And of course, behind all of this was the ever-present shadow of mortality, because food was supposed to keep these kids alive. But for so many, it didn't. Whether it was Charles I of Spain, barely able to chew, or Edward VI, wasting away despite royal feasts, or little Louis XVI starving in prison. Royal children's diets often mirrored the fragility of dynasties themselves. Healthy kids meant stability, sickly kids meant crisis, and meals, humble as they seem, were right at the heart of it all. So, as we drift through this sleepy history tonight, maybe the lesson is simple: power doesn't guarantee health, crowns don't guarantee strong bones, and a golden spoon can still feed you the same bad diet as anyone else, whether it's mush in a silver bowl, venison pies at a banquet, or stale bread in a prison cell. Royal children lived and died by what they could or couldn't eat, and on that thought, let us float onward again. Away from the nurseries, away from the tiny sad chairs and anxious spoonfuls. Next, we slide into something equally strange, the bizarre eating quirks of royals who made it to adulthood, those who turned food itself into obsession, medicine, or theater. When eating became obsession, we drifted through the mushy bowls of royal nurseries. Now let us step into adulthood, where kings and queens weren't just eating to survive or grow up. They were eating to perform, to medicate, or sometimes just to fill the empty hours of monarch life. Indeed, this is where things get quirky. Because when you royal, your diet isn't just about hunger. It is about symbolism, vanity, control, or the slow unraveling of personal sanity. Let us begin with George IV of England. Now, George IV had many hobbies: gambling, mistresses, and bankrupting himself with lavish spending. But one of his most notorious habits was eating. In his youth, he was charming and handsome, nicknamed the first gentleman of England. By middle age, he was less so. He developed an appetite so enormous that his waistline ballooned along with it. Think of him as the original binge eater king. Dinner for George wasn't just a meal. It was a parade. He would consume multiple courses of rich meats, pies, puddings, and wines. And he did it in quantities that horrified even his courtiers, who were themselves no strangers to indulgence. By the end of his life, George was massively obese, suffering from gout, dropsy, and digestive problems that left him confined to bed. Ironically, this first gentleman who had once embodied elegance was reduced to a figure of ridicule, sweating through meals in silk waistcoats stretched to their limits. You can almost picture him, fork in one hand, wheezing breath between bites, courtiers nervously applauding his appetite while praying he wouldn't die at the table. Food, for George, wasn't just fuel. It was addiction, and in a way, it mirrored the decline of his reign: excess without restraint, grandeur without health. But if George ate to excess, others went the opposite way. Take Empress Elisabeth of Austria, better known as Sissi. Sissi was one of those tragic, romantic figures of the 19th century, beautiful, melancholy, and obsessed with maintaining an image of delicate perfection. And her relationship with food was complicated, to say the least. She was fanatical about staying slim, long before dieting became fashionable. Her daily meals were often bizarrely restrictive. Sometimes she would eat nothing but raw milk, oranges, or thin broths. On other days, she fasted almost entirely, surviving on crushed ice mixed with violet syrup. She had her chefs prepare slimming soups made of veal broth strained multiple times to remove any trace of fat. She avoided solid food whenever possible, and when she did indulge, it was usually in sweets, which she would then burn off with hours of horseback riding or exercise. In modern terms, we'd probably call it an eating disorder. But in her own time, it was just chalked up to her eccentricity and obsession with beauty. For Sissi, food wasn't pleasure, it was the enemy. And her delicate, restrictive diet reflected her fragile psyche and deep dissatisfaction with court life. Now, let us drift a little sideways to Frederick the Great of Prussia. Frederick wasn't exactly known for indulgence. He was famously frugal, not just with money, but with food. His favorite meal? Simple boiled vegetables and potatoes. Yes, potatoes, the crop he basically forced onto Prussian farmers. In fact, Frederick became almost symbolic of the potato. He campaigned to make it a staple of the Prussian diet, seeing it as cheap, filling, and practical. There is a legend that he even planted potato fields under guard, so peasants would think the crop was valuable and steal it for themselves. Whether true or not, it shows his obsession. So while other monarchs were binging on pies and pastries, Frederick was quietly munching boiled spuds, probably with a faint air of superiority. It was austere, almost monk-like, but it also matched his militaristic, no-nonsense persona. For him, potatoes weren't just food. They were strategy, of course. Not every monarch leaned austere. Let us drift back to France for a moment and visit Louis XVI. Louis XVI had a different relationship with food than his great-grandfather Louis XVI. While the Sun King turned meals into public theater, Louis XVI liked intimacy. He often dined privately, sometimes in small gatherings with his mistresses. He had a sweet tooth and adored elaborate pastries. creams, and confections. One of his favorite indulgences? Hot chocolate, similar to Charles I of England, but even more decadent. His kitchens at Versailles perfected recipes with vanilla, cinnamon, and sugar, making the royal version of hot cocoa an art form. It was rich, velvety, and exotic, imported from colonies abroad. Food for Louis XV wasn't tea about politics. It was about pleasure, which might explain why his reign drifted into decadence and detachment. He wasn't tea staging public banquets. He was nibbling sweets behind closed doors, while his mistresses teased him with candied fruits. It was charming in the moment, but it hardly projected strength. Indeed then, let us take a sharp turn to Catherine the Great of Russia. Catherine was a shrewd ruler, pragmatic and ambitious. Her diet reflected that mix of practicality and indulgence. She loved Russian staples, cabbage soups, buckwheat kasha, black bread. But she also adored French cuisine, which she imported to court. She had French chefs prepare elaborate meals, blending Russian heartiness with European elegance. Banquets under Catherine were legendary, with dozens of courses, fine wines, and endless toasts. But privately, she preferred simple meals, sour cabbage soup, pickled vegetables, and small portions of roasted meats. Catherine understood food as both politics and personal comfort. Publicly, she feasted to project power. Privately, she kept it modest. In a way, she balanced both sides better than most royals, knowing when to indulge and when to keep it simple and deep. Finally, let us not forget the royals who turned eating into medicine. Many monarchs believed diet could cure their ailments, or at least, their doctors told them so, which led to some strange regimens. Take Charles X of France, who believed drinking a glass of human breast milk daily would restore his health. Yes, you heard that right. Or James I of England, who believed garlic and onions warded off illness, but then complained endlessly about the smell. Or Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George I, who had a habit of fasting cures a days of near starvation punctuated by sips of broth, prescribed by court doctors who believed purging the body was the key to health. Spoiler, it wasn't tea. So, what do we see in all these examples? Eating for excess, eating for beauty, eating for politics, eating for supposed medicine. From George IV collapsing under the weight of his own dinners, to Sissi sipping violet ice as if it could erase her misery, royal diets reveal more than just taste. They reveal vanity, fear, obsession, and sometimes, deep loneliness. Food was never just food in these palaces. It was identity, power, performance. And in the end, it often left rulers just as fragile, sickly, or ridiculous as anyone else. So let us drift onward. We looked at the soldiers, the children, the gluttons, and the dieters. Next, we'll wander into the darker corners, the way food sometimes became poison, literally and metaphorically, for those at the top, but that's for the next quiet stretch. For now, let us just sit with the image of George IV panting over a pie, or Sissi sipping ice water through clenched teeth. Both equally royal, both equally human.